Hi YouTube, it's me, Kevin, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk about how to make a podcast. And unlike some of my previous videos, I'm going to kind of go into a new style here of an instructional type video to teach you how to make a podcast. So, coordinate podcast is a lot more one-dimensional when it comes to editing in comparative to a two-dimensional video medium. Instead of trying to adjust the visual video to match the audio, with a podcast, you only need to focus on one component, which is the audio, which makes the content creation process a lot quicker, in my opinion. Besides that, there are many other benefits to starting your own podcast instead of making videos. Number one, I would say the file sizes for audio are much smaller than those of video, which makes it a lot easier for publishing and transferring files. Number two, I would say hiding your mistakes and editing things out of your audio files for a podcast are significantly easier because you only need to focus on that one component of audio instead of audio and visual. And thirdly and finally, retaking audio if you need to take it for your podcast is a lot less labor intensive than getting that perfect video shot. Because of these points and some other factors, I've shifted my creative process and my passion a bit away from video editing and moved it towards podcast creation. But I wanted to come back here onto this platform and teach you guys some of the things I learned in the podcasting world and publishing my own podcasts. So, you guys can call me the Podfather from now on. I will be going through 3 major steps on creating your own podcast in this video, as well as some helpful tips and tricks along the way. So before we dive straight into this, we need to know exactly what a podcast is, as some of you might not know the very basics of what a podcast really is in its essence. I'll be brief about my description, but this is what the definition of a podcast is said to be. A podcast, by definition, is a digital audio file available on the internet for downloading to a computer or mobile device. Typically, it's available as a series, new installments of which can be received by subscribers automatically. A podcast, or generically netcast, is an episodic series of digital audio or video files which a user can download in order to listen to. It's often available for subscription so that new episodes are automatically downloaded via web syndication to a user's own local computer, mobile application, or portable media player. In my very own words, I would define a podcast as an audio file that can be streamed or downloaded from the internet that usually resembles a radio show. There are usually many episodes, like a show, that anyone can make, from famous comedians to professional athletes, writers, political journalists, to even average people like you and me. Like a TV show, podcasts are meant to be interesting and capture the audience's attention. They can be informative or just downright funny. That is the beauty of podcasts. They can speak on whatever subject they want to and in whatever format they want. So, it's important that before you begin your podcasting journey, that you draw a little inspiration and some ideas of what a professional podcast sounds like from the examples of previous podcasts. So hopefully, your podcast can sound like them one day too. My first example of a great podcast is Vox Today Explained. It's a daily news podcast. The podcast usually only ranges from 20 to 30 minutes, capturing the attention of the listener. The sound design in this podcast is a great example because of the emphasis the host uses throughout the podcast, additional musical or sound edits that are put into it, and finally because of the dramatic pauses that they leave in just to emphasize a subject.
Kay Steiger, you run election coverage here at Vox. There were primaries in 5 states this week, but everyone's talking about one state and one race. What happened Tuesday night in New York?
Sometimes, no sound at all is more impactful than saying anything to drive a point forward. My second example is a show called If I Were You, and it's an advice show hosted by 2 comedians, Jacob Hurwitz and Amir Blumenfeld. They do a great job in demonstrating how to have a clean and consistent format for their show that continues to bring listeners back weekly. The show also has some guests and does justice to them, including them into conversations so beautifully and naturally and asking the best questions to make their content so much more interesting.
That was so bad. Thomas Middleditch and Ben Schwartz. Jake on guitar.
Thank you.
First guests who have ever recorded their own intro music. That was really good.
It's kind of beautiful, yeah.
Yeah.
Towards the end.
Can't wait to hear that back in 7 months.
My third example and my last example is Buckets, and it's also hosted by the comedian Amir Blumenfeld. This podcast is sort of a fusion mixture of comedy and NBA/basketball talk. In the podcast, it brings up recent subjects that occur within the NBA league, which make for exciting opinion topics. It's also a great podcast which shows the effect of use of stats in interesting ways to make them appealing for the audience. Amir is genius by using stats to quiz his guests on their knowledge of their favorite teams and players, but it also makes it quite interesting for the audience member and very entertaining to hear them talk about these stats.
My guest today is an exception to the rule, a man with an ever-changing favorite team because his number one squad is LeBron James.
LeBron James.
Please welcome to the show the Gary Payton to my Sean Kemp, the Jeff Hornacek to my John Stockton, the Rex Chapman to my Michael Finley, Jake Hurwitz.
You're getting buckets.
So to start, you're going to need some physical equipment to be on your way to publish your very own podcast. I'm going to make a list here, and I'm going to add it to the description in the box below. So if you'd like to purchase any of these things, they'll be in the description. So some items you're going to need to start your very own podcast are things like a condenser microphone, like the one I have right in front of me. This one has a pop filter and an arm to mount. You don't necessarily need those things. Those things are a little bit more optional, but I find that they help me make my podcast so much easier. Another thing you're going to need is a computer or a laptop, and that is to edit your audio files on. So make sure that you have a good computer or laptop. The third thing you're going to need when making a podcast is a good pair of headphones like these guys right over here. I use these Corsair Bluetooth headphones that are very good quality, so I can listen to the sound feedback and I can get a really good edit on my podcasts. And finally, the last thing that you're going to need is some sort of editing software to actually edit your podcast and put it together for publishing. But don't worry, if you're worried about having all of these things to make a podcast and how much it's going to cost, you actually don't need all of these things. If you have something like a smartphone like this one right over here, you could potentially actually make your podcast with just this. Well, you would also need some headphones, but besides that, you might be able to find the software that you need, and it already comes with a microphone. So now that we got that out of the way, let's explore the actual steps into executing the production of your very own podcast. And I'll break it up into 3 parts, like I said before, so that it's simple for you to remember. Step 1 is the preparation. So the first thing that you're going to need is an idea or a subject to start your podcast journey. Something that will draw in an audience that you're passionate about. Listeners can tell if you're genuine about a subject you speak about, so make sure you won't burn out on that idea. After you have that idea ready to go, it's time to look into formatting. So, with that idea, you can start to mold it into more of a show. The format is very important, as it'll give your show routine and structure. Will it be a solo show, co-hosted by somebody else, an interview style, a call-in show? You decide. Make sure that you keep the format throughout the episodes going forward. Or maybe not. It's all up to your style. After you got your format sorted out, it's time to go for a name. Probably one of the most important details to determine when preparing a podcast. It needs to be catchy and memorable so that the viewers can remember it and it's easily searchable. And the last element I would say in preparation is a script. It's always good to prepare a script before a podcast. It doesn't have to be word by word, but it should have discussion points or topics or questions to continue the conversation naturally. It's good to have a plan on how your show should run if it seems like it's starting to get off topic. Then you can use it to move back on topic. So it's great to have that in your back pocket. Just make a script. Step number 2 into making your very own podcast is just do it. Nike, please do not sue me. It's finally time to put all that preparation and actually record your podcast. Now, you will need to set up your podcast for recording, so that means setting it up in a quiet space. Don't forget that. You're going to need to prepare all your gear that you will need for that session, and make sure that people know that you are recording your podcast. So don't forget, you're going to need your microphone, recording software or device, a script, headphones, other podcast members if needed, and then you just need to do it. Remember that you can make edits like pauses and breaks later in the editing process after the recording. Remember to speak clearly, and it's always best to test your recording tools before going through with the actual recording. Now, I personally use a software called Audacity when I'm making my podcast, and it's also the software I use for recording. So I'll leave that again in the link in the description. After recording, the editing can finally begin. Remember to cut any areas that are unnecessary for the podcast, and you can change the levels from your editing software. A helpful tip that I want to give you guys for the editing process involves the recording process. When you're recording, try to record 10 to 15 seconds of just the room quiet. This is a sound profile, and it will help you reduce background noise when you're editing your clip as a whole. Having things like a theme song or an introduction to every episode is also very important to drawing in a consistent audience. If you hook them into the episode within the first minute, you can hopefully keep those listeners coming back. You can add dramatic background music or sounds if it applies to your podcast to make it a little bit more interesting, and somewhere that I'd really recommend checking it out is the YouTube Audio Library, which offers royalty-free music and sound effects. Now, to capture new listeners, it's important to use cover art to your advantage. They say never judge a book by its cover, but many podcasts are judged by their cover art. I use a program called Pixlr. Again, I will leave the link in the description below to create my very own podcast art. And it can be your decision to make cover art for every episode like I do on Pixlr, or to just have one piece of cover art for the entire podcast series. Remember, this will be the first thing a listener sees, so entice them to listen by having something interesting for your cover art. And our last step into how to make a podcast is publishing. The final step after editing, and possibly the most important step, is to publish your podcast piece. Pick a podcast host and promote it. Now that you've gotten to this final step, it might seem very easy with all the preparation and application that you've done to make your podcast. But it can have a weighing effect on which decisions you make within this publishing step. The first thing you need to do is get a host to publish your podcast. They are going to be able to distribute it to different sites like Google, Spotify, iTunes, in order that so your podcast could be listened to on multiple platforms. Here are a couple recommendations of podcasting sites that I found that can host your podcast. The first one is Spreaker. This is the first ever podcast hosting site that I ever use. They might have ads apparently, but they can hold 5 hours of podcast content. Number 2 is Podium. I've personally never used it, but I'm told that they have an unlimited storage space to how many podcasts they can hold, and that they're able to distribute it to Apple and Spotify. And my third recommendation is Anchor, which I use for my podcast personally right now. They also have a 5-hour limit to content of podcast storage. And they also have the available option of being able to monetize your podcast if they become more successful in the future. So remember, these hosting sites should be able to distribute your podcast to different platforms where more listeners can tune in, such as Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and iTunes. But if not, your hosting site should be able to give you an RSS URL feed. And with this URL, you're able to go into each site or platform manually, and you can actually distribute your podcast through them. So don't worry if your hosting site doesn't do it automatically. There are ways that you can distribute it yourself. Don't forget to add a title for each episode of a podcast you make and a description, as there are people who do read them, and tell people about them. And you want to promote your podcast. Tell people on social media, tell your friends, try to get word of mouth out there. But it's important to promote your podcast yourself and tell people what they can listen into. So the last tip that I'd like to leave you guys with is podcasts don't necessarily depend on the equipment that you use. I find that podcasts that are more interesting depend on their content, the subject, and how the host handles the show. You might not necessarily have the fanciest equipment, but if your show is captivating, if it's funny, if it's interesting, if it's informative, people will keep coming back to it. So just remember, you could always upgrade things later. You can get yourself a Zoom, you can get yourself a podcasting arm like this, or a pop filter, or anything else that you think you might need. But you don't need the fancy stuff to start your podcast today. So I'd like to wish all of you guys trying to make your own podcasts out there the best of luck. And hopefully all my tips have helped you out into starting your very own podcast. If you guys would like some more information or details on how to get your podcast on a hosting site, or how I edit my podcast myself, just leave a question in the comments down below. Please give this video a like and subscribe. And if you have any other questions or any other how-to videos you'd like me to do on any other subjects, it doesn't have to be podcast related. I'd love to hear about it in the comments down below. Tell me how I did, guys, with this video, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye. Hi guys, just wanted to thank you so much for watching that video and coming this far. I just wanted to let you know that I also have a podcast available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast. It's called The Ball is Life Show, and it's a basketball/NBA podcast. So if you want to check that out, you can hit the link on my YouTube channel banner, or you can find it on one of those sites. Consider subscribing.